Hi there, Ms. Fennell with you here today, and I am not in school today. I am at home waiting for my new wash machine to be delivered, which could happen at any time. So you are here today working on two different lessons. So the first lesson today is going to be types of reproduction notes. And so instead of me doing a lecture today, this is an ed puzzle. So remember, in the ed puzzle, if you miss a question, you can hit the little recycle arrow. The little recycle arrow will replay the most recent section. And so if you miss a question, you should get it. I am intending these questions to be easy, so that if you're paying attention, you should get them all right, okay? If I come back Wednesday and I see that your ed puzzle score is really low, I'm going to give you a hard time, because that probably means you weren't even trying and you weren't paying attention, okay? So the first half of our chapter, and by the way, hopefully tomorrow when I come back, I will remind me, but we'll have you go over your quizzes and see which questions you got wrong. Remember that quizzes are kind of like practice tests. We want to learn from our mistakes. We want to do better on the test at the end of the chapter. All right, so that's the goal. We'll go over those when I come back on Wednesday. So now we are getting into the second half of this chapter. The first half of the chapter was about DNA. What DNA is, how it works, how we read DNA language. One of our biggest takeaways should have been genes, which are pieces of DNA, code for proteins, which give us traits. This half of the chapter, we're going to get into more of that heredity piece. And this DNA that is being given to the next generation, what is it? How does that work? How do the genes get inherited? And how do we pass these genes then on to the next generation? So this is what we're going to get into in this whole second half of the chapter. So we'll start today with types of reproduction. Oh, by the way, other questions. Number one, you're going to do this ed puzzle. And then when you're done with this ed puzzle, the second thing on the list is a website that you're going to go to and then answer some questions. So those are the two things that you're going to do while I'm gone today. And then if you finish with both of those, make sure you don't have any other missing work. Make sure you did the GIM kit from before the quiz, all of that. And then you may sit and just work quietly on your computer, maybe on other subjects if you still have more time at the end, okay? So types of reproduction. Sometimes kids get a little nervous when we hear, oh, we're going to learn about reproduction in science class. No, we're not going to get into a lot about necessarily human reproduction, but we're going to be talking about how living things can make more of themselves. And many kids are surprised to learn that many different kinds of living things have multiple different pathways, multiple different ways that they can actually make more of themselves. So that's what we're going to get into. And also we're going to be focusing on how those genes are inherited from one generation to the next. So first of all, a word that we're going to use a lot in this half of the chapter is the word offspring. And the word offspring just means children. And so whether we're talking about humans or cats or dogs or plants, if we use the word offspring, we're meaning the babies, right? The babies, the children that the parents have. All right. So the first kind of reproduction is, and this word kind of makes people nervous sometimes, sexual reproduction. Don't get too bent out of shape. Oak trees do sexual reproduction. And my standard joke is, you're not going to look outside one day and go, look out the window. Oh my gosh, what are those oak trees doing? Don't look, kids, Sexual reproduction in biology simply means reproduction that involves two parents. Two parents are contributing genetic material to the offspring, to the child. And so each of the parents are going to give the offspring half of their DNA. Okay, so if we think about it, this is how reproduction works in humans. And might I just say again, how amazing it is that living things can make more of themselves. I mean, that's really crazy when you stop and think about it. Non-living things obviously cannot do that, but living things can copy themselves. And we're so used to that. We maybe just take that for granted, but it's kind of a cool thing. So sexual reproduction simply means two-parent reproduction. Two parents are each going to give the offspring half of the offspring's new DNA. A pro or an advantage to this kind of reproduction is we get genetic mixing of offspring. You get offspring, you get children that are genetically just a little bit different than either one of the parents. They have similar characteristics, yet they're kind of a melding of both, right? The con or the disadvantage to this is that if you're going to have two-parent reproduction, you have to have two parents. So somehow out there in nature, they're going to have to find mates. And of course, for humans, that can be an issue. If you're thinking about like earthworms digging their way through the soil is their whole life, finding a mate, finding another earthworm can be a challenge. If you're a whale out swimming in the big, worldwide ocean, that can be a challenge. Many species have really interesting ways of finding a mate. My favorite are some of the birds. In many of the birds, the female actually chooses the male that she's going to mate with. And in some birds, the males actually will do a mating dance. And we'll get into this more in the spring when we study birds. But the male bird will do a little mating dance. I think we saw that in one of the Great Migrations video. And then the female chooses the mate. And so it's kind of interesting how some of that happens. To do two-parent reproduction, we have to form first reproductive cells. The fancy word for reproductive cells is called gametes, and they're formed during a process called meiosis. This creates egg and sperm cells that have half the amount of DNA as a regular cell. So just to explain this a little more, this is a process of meiosis. So we start with regular cells that have a regular amount of chromosomes, and then basically they go through what we call cell division twice, and instead of having 4 chromosomes like this cell does, all of our gametes will end up with 2. Remember when we did our karyotyping, human cells have 46 chromosomes normally. Therefore, our reproductive cells, the egg cells in females, the sperm cells in male, will only have 23 chromosomes. Okay, so some really big words are throwing at with you. This type of cell division is called meiosis, and it's going to make cells with half the number of chromosomes. And then those reproductive cells are going to be used to make the new offspring. So flowers, many plants do sexual reproduction. Flowers do two-parent reproduction. And a flower is actually the reproductive organ of plants. And so within a flower, this is kind of just a cartoon version, all the different parts of a flower. There's all kinds of different flowers. Some of them look like this, some of them don't. I'll show you a few pictures in just a second. In the middle here, we have the female part of the flower. The whole thing here, this orange part, is called the pistil. And at the end of the pistil, there's a stigma, and this is an open tube. At the bottom of the open tube is this part called the ovary, which contains the eggs. And what has to happen in plants for seeds to form is we need pollen to fertilize the eggs. In flowers, the pollen is the male reproductive cell and the eggs are the female. These other parts here called the stamens that have these anthers at the top, this is where the pollen is produced. So the pollen is produced here. Now it varies by plant. Some plants, the pollen from one plant has to fertilize another plant. Some plants are self-fertilizing where their pollen can fertilize their own eggs, and that will work. All kinds of plants have different ways of moving this pollen around. Some plants just depend on the wind to blow and move their pollen around. Some plants actually need a pollinator, like a bird or a bee or some other kind of insect, maybe a butterfly. And as they move from one flower to the next, drinking nectar that's produced by the flower, they move the pollen around and put it on the stigma. It travels down the stigma and then will fertilize the eggs at the base of the ovary. Okay, so flowers are basically reproductive structures in plants. Dandelions are really interesting. If we get the chance this spring, we will go outside on a day to do one of my favorite little labs called the dandelion study. Don't have any out there right now. But on the dandelion, you can see the petals are on the edge. In the middle here, dandelions actually are a kind of a compound flower, and they have hundreds of pistils on the inside. At the end of each one of their pistils is one egg. These little Y-shaped little things right here are the anthers, are the male reproductive part of the flower. And that's the part, if you take the dandelion and rub it on your skin, you get the yellow left behind. It's actually the pollen from the dandelion that's getting left behind on your skin. The wind just blows and will fertilize. It will move the pollen from here to the pistils. And then, of course, the pollen fertilizes the eggs. The flower then closes. The seeds are formed at the bottom of the ovary. Then it opens up and then the wind blows the seeds away. That's kind of how a dandelion works. If you look at tomatoes, by the way, the bottom of this ovary This is where the seeds will form, and a ripened ovary then becomes a fruit. So oftentimes the base of the flower, if you're growing vegetables like a watermelon, or if you're looking at apples on apple trees or tomatoes on tomato plants, you'll actually see the base of the flower is what turns into the fruit, and it will develop into the fruit around the ripened ovary. This is a picture of one of my favorite flowers. These are oak tree flowers, people. They just look like these weird green stringy things hanging down off the oak trees. Most people don't think they look like flowers at all. They don't have petals, and that's because oak trees don't need to attract a bird or a bee. They don't need to be beautiful or smell good or anything. They just depend on the wind. And if we zoomed in on these, you would see anthers and you would see pistils in the middle of these flowers as well. These are aspen tree blossoms. I don't know if you were in person this fall, we went out, or if you were distance, we did the slideshow of the tree that has the, it's over by the softball fields here at school. It has the white bark. We'll go out again this spring and you will see these really kind of worm-like things, these fuzzy caterpillar-looking things hanging off the tree. These are the aspen tree flowers. And again, they have pistils and anthers, and they have pollen that's fertilizing eggs and will eventually produce the seeds on these plants. Also, when we get to our plant unit in the spring, hopefully we'll get the chance to dissect a seed. And the easiest one to do is a bean seed. After the seeds form, it's kind of cool. There's a baby plant inside every seed, what we call the little embryo plant that has a stem and leaves and stored food. So there's stored food and a baby plant and a seed coat inside every seed. And so eventually seeds are made. Pollen is really interesting to look at. If we enlarge pollen, you see that it looks all spiky because it needs to stick to that pistil and travel down to fertilize the eggs. Many of us are also allergic to pollen. Pollen is kind of the case, and inside the pollen is the plant sperm. So if you have hay fever allergies, you're allergic to plant sperm. Sorry to break it to you, but pollen has all these crazy shapes. Each shape is from like a different kind of plant. And oftentimes people who study plants can identify the type of plant. They know the shape of the pollen and what pollen comes from each plant. This is just a picture of, again, a flower ripening. So this is an apple blossom, and we start out with the apple flower and the inside of the flower and then the ovary. And then by the way, for apple trees, you have to have 2 apple trees within a certain distance of each other in order to get the flowers, the eggs fertilized and to form fruit. If you just plant one apple tree and you don't have any other apple trees anywhere around, you won't get apples on your trees. In order to get apples, you have to have pollen exchanged between 2 different trees. Apples cannot self-pollinate. They actually need bees to transfer the pollen from one plant to the next. Doesn't have to be the same species of apples. There's lots of varieties of apples. There's Honeycrisp, there's crab apples, but just has to be, it depends on the tree, what kind of other one can fertilize it. And then what happens is the ovary begins to grow. The fertilized eggs turn into seeds. The definition technically of a fruit is that it's a ripened ovary. So technically speaking, now not in grocery store terms, but in biological terms, a watermelon is a fruit. Apples are fruit, but pumpkins are also fruit. They are ripened ovaries. What's another example? Cucumbers are fruit, technically. Anything that has seeds inside of it is a fruit. It's a ripened ovary part of a plant. Okay, so plants, once again, can do 2-parent reproduction, as can many animals. Again, sexual reproduction, we have 2 parents contributing genes to the child, to the offspring, and the child is going to get half their DNA from each parent. Okay, so that is the big thing with 2-parent reproduction. And we will talk more about how these genes get passed on in the rest of our chapter. The second kind of reproduction you might not be familiar with at all is called asexual reproduction. And asexual reproduction is just 1-parent reproduction. This is crazy. This is kind of mind-blowing. There's many living things that can actually just have 1 parent do reproduction and reproduce offspring without having a mate. So the pro to this kind of reproduction is you don't need to waste time finding a mate. You can make a lot of offspring very quickly with this way, and many living things can do one-parent reproduction. Humans can't. We need two parents. The con, I don't know why I have this line in here. I don't know what's going on there. The con is that offspring are usually genetically exactly the same as the parents. The offspring end up being clones of the parent. All right. And there's generally three kinds of asexual reproduction that we can have. So let me show you some pictures. So this one, asexual reproduction, is just regular cell division. And we're actually going to get into cell division is going to be our next lesson. But regular cell division is needed. We start with 2 chromosomes. We end with 2 chromosomes. We just need regular cell division to do this one. So one kind of asexual reproduction in plants is plants can send off something called runners. And if you have experience with strawberry plants, that there's other trees that do this, and there's all kinds of plants that do this too. Strawberry is just the example I picked to show here. You have the main plant, and then the main plant will send off a stem, and along that stem, you'll get new strawberry plants growing. And those new strawberry plants will then send down roots. So if you start with one strawberry plant 1 year and you take good care of it and everything, within 2 or 3 or 4 years, you can literally have hundreds of strawberry plants in your strawberry patch because they will just reproduce on their own. They'll just send out runners. Now, the weird thing about this is every one of these plants, if you were to do DNA analysis on any of these plants and sequence their DNA, they would be clones of each other. They would be genetically exactly the same. So they can reproduce very quickly. Strawberries do make seeds. Strawberries are the only plant that have their seeds on the outside of the fruit, which is kind of interesting. And they do form from the strawberry flower, and you have pollen that's formed. So strawberries you can grow from seeds. I don't know any gardener who would ever grow strawberries from seeds, because the much easier way is just to take a clipping of somebody else's plant, plant one, and then just let it go crazy, send out runners. And this is a form of one parent or asexual reproduction. Oh, look, I have a better picture of this. So yeah, this is a diagram of the strawberry plant. It does form flowers with eggs and pollen, and the seeds are actually on the outside. But again, fastest way to make more strawberries is to allow these runners to go off. These put down roots, and many plants do that. I have a house plant called a spider plant that makes little baby spiders on it, and if you take the spider off and plant it, it will grow into a whole new plant. There are different kinds of trees. Poplar trees will actually send up shoots, and they will send kind of underground runners that then pop up and become new trees. If you plant one poplar tree, pretty soon you can have a whole bunch of them. And sometimes they're even kind of hard to control because they just send up these runners and they start going. Another kind of one-parent reproduction is called budding. This one's kind of funny. And I always think this would be funny if humans could do this one. It's kind of funny. But an example that can do this is a little microscopic animal called a hydra. And what the hydras do is they just grow this little bud off the side of them, and then the little bud just breaks off and starts living its own life. Isn't that funny? So this is just called budding because it grows another little bud. And this bud that is produced is genetically exactly the same as this parent. And so this is, again, another kind of asexual reproduction. Can you imagine if humans reproduce this way, and like one day you're walking around, all of a sudden you're just growing your identical twin off of your side, and it just grows and gets so big and then breaks off and just becomes its own person. And it's your identical twin, just, it's your bud. I don't know. It's kind of funny that can happen. Another example, which we're actually going to see in class starting tomorrow, probably a couple days from now, we're going to see an example of something called regeneration. There are many animals, and this blows my mind too. They're simple animals. No animal with a backbone can do this to this extent. Some animals with backbones can regrow a lost arm or a leg or something, but they can't completely regrow the whole thing. So there are these very simple worms called Planaria, and what happens with them is if they get cut in half, both halves will regrow into a complete new worm. These also, if you just cut off their head, they'll just regrow a new head. If you cut off their tail, they'll just regrow a new tail. You can actually cut them into 236 pieces, and all 236 pieces will regrow into a new Planarian worm. Simple hydras can do the same thing. If you cut them in half, both halves will regrow. Now, both of these worms are genetically exactly the same as the starter worm, as the parent. Just blows my mind. This hydra is the same. These two halves will be the same. The starfish is the same. If you cut off an arm, it will regrow new the one that you cut off will regrow an arm, and this will regrow a body, and they can actually make more of themselves this way. All right. Just some Planaria. Oh, here's some Planaria previews. We're actually going to get these worms in the classroom here and cut them apart and do this. I may even, online people will have to let me know if I let you come in and pick up a Planarian worm. Would you want to come in and pick one of these up and maybe do this at home? Will your parents let you have worms? They're really small. They're super small. They're not very big. They're not as big as an earthworm. But it's kind of fun. You can just use a spoon, cut off the head, and then watch it regrow its head. Oh, it's crazy. All right. So this, once again, these are all examples of one parent or asexual reproduction. Again, the con is that you get offspring that are genetically exactly the same. The reason that that's a problem is if you have a disease that this clones are susceptible to, it will wipe out your whole population. The nice thing with the two-parent reproduction is you get some more variation, you get some more differences in your offspring. And that way, if you have a disease come through, it's not necessarily going to maybe wipe out the whole population. Maybe there'll be one or two that have a variation that allow them to survive the disease. So sometimes it's a problem if you wind up with a whole group of living things that are genetically exactly the same. More variation usually helps living things survive, if that makes sense. All right. So those are the two kinds of reproduction. What you're going to be doing next is the second thing listed in Schoology for you today is you won't use this link, but it's listed in Schoology. You're going to go to this website where you are going to read all about, there's I think 17 different organisms here that are listed. You're going to read about how they reproduce, how they make more of themselves, and then you're going to click if you think that's sexual or asexual, or can they do both kinds. And it'll tell you here if you have the right or wrong answer. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can go right to the website. You can read about each one and jot it down. And then you're going to have questions. There's a question about each organism. So you could read this and do the questions at the same time, or you could do one. This seahorse is really interesting. It's really, the males are that give birth in seahorses. Isn't this crazy? The kangaroo is really interesting. Some of these are just really interesting. What is this one? I don't remember what this one is. Oh, anyway, go to the second thing listed in Schoology. I can't even remember what we called it right now. I think it's different kinds of reproduction, but you're going to go visit the website. You're going to get information from the website, and you're going to use it to answer the questions. Okay? Be good. Have a great day. Do your second assignment, and I will see you on Wednesday. Whoop, whoop. Bye.